On June 30th at 10:36 p.m., we got a push notification from the New York Times. And then all of the comments started pouring in. People saying things like euphoria and disbelief. That I've spent 20 years banging my head against a wall. That they thought we were chasing windmills. And
the most consequential housing reform that we've seen in modern history.
That last comment was from Gavin Newsom, governor of California. What everyone was talking about was a landmark decision to scale back the 55-year-old California Environmental Quality Act, better known as CEQA. In the past half century, CEQA has morphed into something so expansive that almost anyone could file a lawsuit to stop a project. For years, major CEQA reform had been seen as politically impossible. But suddenly, after decades of work and a single dramatic vote, it was done. It almost felt too easy. So, what did it actually take to get here? And why now, after all of these years? And what lessons can we learn for tackling other big challenges where politics and policy seem completely gridlocked? Welcome to Everybody Gets Pie, the podcast about making the American pie of opportunity big enough so that everybody can get their slice. This is a podcast where we'll be discussing the need for more American abundance in housing, in energy, in childcare, in innovation, and more. I'm Justine, and as always, but for the first time, I'm joined by Armand and Burhan. It's great to have you guys join me for the podcast.
It's fantastic to be here, Justine. I'm so excited to be joining with you and Armand and to talk about all the ways that we can use policy to expand the American pie and make a better life for everyone.
I'm sorry, I think I went to the wrong podcast. I thought this was about baking.
Oh, sorry. You're at the wrong one.
I think I took the wrong turn at podcast studio.
Armand the baker, so you can actually help us make some pumpkin pie, other pies. I don't know, whatever your favorite.
Well, we do have some delicious pie on the cover photo of this podcast.
Bake up some, as you will learn in this podcast journey. I like to bake up a lot of terrible jokes. So
I think we will soon learn that. Burhan, I do have to mention that both you and I are on city councils. We are both elected officials. You are in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm in Falls Church, Virginia. So we both kind of understand the behind the scenes of local politics since we're both elected council members. But Armand, I actually want to start with you. You were actually around for the battle over CEQA reform 10 years ago. It was not the first time it was attempted reform and not the last. But I'm curious what it was like back then versus today.
So I've been involved in housing activism, what is called the YIMBY movement, yes, in my backyard for over 10 years now. And in 2015 and 2016, I was working for Guest, now State Senator Scott Wiener's campaign. And that was the first time I ever heard this phrase used, which is the governor is at his most powerful in the budget, which means that the governor of California has his most influence and ability to change policy when he introduces trailer bills, because those trailer bills have to pass in order for the budget to pass. And Senator Scott Wiener told me that when he was talking about Governor Jerry Brown's proposed budget trailer bill to reform the California Environmental Quality Act in 2016. But despite the governor being sort of at the peak of his power, he was still not powerful enough to overcome the entrenched powerful interests that didn't want CEQA reform. And so, fast forward 10 years in 2025, and I heard that same old phrase, the governor is at his most powerful in the budget, coming from the same old voice, Scott Wiener. I didn't feel great. A California governor was trying to push through major CEQA reform through the budget. I'd heard this story before, and I did not like the ending. But sometimes you get a second chance, and sometimes you get a second ending. And this time, the story had a different ending. California exempted almost all new apartments built in urban areas from CEQA, and honestly, it's very hard to believe.
It's funny. This is a case where history rhymed but didn't repeat. So
Yeah.
it's nice to see that there was a different outcome this time. It also reminds me of there's a Hemingway quote which says, how did you go bankrupt? And he says, two ways, gradually, then suddenly. And so it almost feels like I guess the reform happened in two ways. It was gradual, like, or nothing was happening at all. And then suddenly everything, well, it went through.
Yeah, it's so much about what I think about local politics is that everything feels impossible until it feels like it's inevitable. CEQA reform here passed almost unanimously, and it took, years and years and years of building the YIMBY movement, doing all this sorts of stuff. And then all of a sudden, we're kind of in this messy middle where YIMBYism has had a lot of success, and this is in some ways a capstone moment, but also it's almost transforming into this abundance movement, or at least playing on this other word, and we're trying to enter a second decade, a second era, and kind of seeing where we will go. And this is kind of like also the first big win of that era. So it's a beautiful, interesting intersection, and we'll kind of see what all of a sudden felt impossible, days, years ago, will now feel inevitable. Like something does not go from, being really contentious to being almost unanimous without winning a lot of hearts and minds on the way. And so I think it's a beautiful story about how even in like a divided, very partisan, very ideological America, you can go around and try to persuade and win over Democrats, win over Republicans, win over people on the far left and on the far right, and all get behind, what at the end of the day seems like a good idea.
Yeah.
I mean, I never would have imagined the governor of California explicitly citing a book when he's like making an announcement about a bill and like shouting out the author.
And that was Abundance by Ezra Klein.
As Abundance by Ezra Klein. It's like,
And Derek
Derek Thompson.
Yeah, sorry.
Who should have gotten a shout out, my boy Derek. I'm sorry. You'll get him next time. But yeah, what's funny is like, so I did debate in high school and college, and I sort of had this like idea when I was younger of like, well, if you make good arguments and research ideas and you can convince people. And then part of becoming older is I got cynical and was like, no, that's not actually how it works. It's all about power and turnout and winning elections. And this is almost like a return to the naivete. I don't know how to use that word. Naivete.
Yeah.
English is not my first language.
Polish.
Yes. Yeah. I didn't learn English until preschool, and I learned English a very difficult way because my parents, tangent, we can cut it out, but my parents didn't want to admit that I didn't speak English because they thought it would be a disadvantage. So they stuck me in like a preschool, like a Catholic preschool, and there was these nuns, and they all thought I was they're like stupid or something. So I just have these traumatic memories of large nuns like yelling at me in incomprehensible babble.
I will forgive you for mispronouncing a French word.
That's true. It's not even a good excuse for mispronouncing. Anyway, the point I was trying to make is just like, I feel like I've returned to the youthful idealism of like, wow, actually people like wrote arguments and persuaded people and people's minds changed. Huh. You know?
Yeah, I think that brings us back to the hopeful story. Like, hey, we can actually change people's minds and get a close to unanimous vote that cross party lines where we can actually agree on things and like move things forward to help get things built. So yeah, that was super inspiring. And we were fortunate enough to have the authors of the CEQA reform bill join us. That was Senator Scott Wiener and Assemblymember Buffy Wicks. And we first asked them if they were surprised that their bills made it through with such little pushback. Let's take a listen.
It was exciting because I think it was a long time coming. I think we've known for a long time that CEQA is an important law that has also grown way beyond what anyone intended it to do, and has been used as a tool to stop projects for reasons having nothing to do with the environment. And so I think a lot of people have known for a while that it needs reform, and this was a big step in doing that. To be clear, this is not the global reform of CEQA. It's a meaningful step to address some of the problems that it's caused.
Great. So I had a little follow-up. I was actually very curious, like you guys made huge news in this, and it was important both for California, but also for the whole country. We've been having this conversation about abundance, and I was like curious, do you think that the groundswell had a role in like the abundance movement as it's emerging, had a role in getting this passed, or was it mostly like, the YIMBY movement and all the work that you guys have been doing to get the legislature and governor on board for years, or a mix of all of the above?
I mean, I think YIMBY is just one aspect of
Yeah.
abundance, and we've been this work has been happening for a long time, long before anyone was calling it abundance. It was sort of the general notion that we make it way too hard to do anything in California, and that CEQA, among other tools, is used to stop progress, whether it's housing or childcare centers or clean energy or whatever the case may be. And so, I think that this notion has been around, and this general, I think, viewpoint and perception. And we now have labels for it. First YIMBY, now abundance, and that's great.
And I'll actually just add on to that, if that's okay. I got elected in 2016. I got elected in 2018. Scott got elected in 2016. And there has been this growing YIMBY movement to push for more housing, right? Which I think we have really benefited from. And grassroots activists showing up at city council meetings for the last couple of years, that's been super helpful. The one thing I will also say, though, about the abundance aspect of this is I do think it provided a really interesting and helpful intellectual framework for some of our colleagues. I had a couple members who represent more suburban districts who have not voted for streamlining, some wealthier communities who really bought into the notion of what the book was saying, and felt like, okay, this is a vote I'm totally willing to take because I buy into this notion. And this feels, the political price that I'm going to pay feels worth it because the magnitude of the solution is real on this bill, on the bills that we had. And so I do think, for each member, we kind of power map each member, try to understand who motivates each member. Some members are motivated by the realtors. Some members are motivated by the building trades. Some members are motivated by their landlords or some by, renters, advocates. And so for some of our colleagues, I do think there was a real openness because of the abundance critique.
So that sort of answers the why now question. Like, why did this not happen 5 years ago or 10 years ago?
Well, we need to be really clear that this was not the first time that we've addressed CEQA. What we did this year was really significant, but all of the major housing streamlining laws that we passed, that I've authored, that Buffy's authored, that other members have authored, they remove entire classes of projects from CEQA entirely. And so we have multiple laws in the books that we passed over the last decade, ranging from accessory dwelling units, also called in-law units, to SB 35, which was the first major streamlining law that I authored to expedite permitting, or AB 2011 that Buffy authored for commercial conversions to residential. All of these laws created what we call ministerial approval, which means no CEQA at all. And so that's been something we've been doing for a while, and we've created a number of exemptions from CEQA, and exemptions are very powerful because it means CEQA doesn't apply. So with that said, the two laws that we passed this year were a big deal. One of them makes some changes to CEQA itself, which is something we normally don't do in the legislature. And then the other one exempts infill housing from CEQA entirely. So I think these laws built on work that we've been doing for a while.
Assemblymember Wicks, we've heard a lot of examples of like what we should fix from CEQA. I'm curious if you have any stories you could tell us of like what are the craziest like ways that people have used CEQA.
I mean, we have endless examples, and we've had decades of low-hanging fruit of terrible examples of how CEQA has been weaponized to stop literally everything from being built. But a couple off the top of my head, one in my own district, UC Berkeley, which is 10% of students at Cal will experience homelessness while they are students at Cal, one of the best higher ed institutions in the world, and 10% of the students experiencing homelessness. So just sit with that stat for a second. But in part because the cost of housing is so expensive and it's so difficult to build here, there's notorious NIMBY groups that are homeowners that live within a quarter mile to half mile of the campus, but don't want the campus to build student housing for their students and sue under all kinds of premises to stop housing. But one of the more recent and egregious examples was on People's Park, which has been essentially an open air drug market for a really long time. It's been trying to be redeveloped for a long time. And the university had proposed 1,200 units for students and also a section of those for those experiencing homelessness, along with open space to commemorate the history of People's Park. That was sued using CEQA, saying that students are going to be loud and that human noise is pollution. And so, by God, we can't stand that pollution of those young people. They're so loud, so we're gonna sue. So that is, I think, one example. We ended up having to do a law to say human noise doesn't count as pollution, which is like bonkers to me that we actually had to pass a law that says that, but we did it. And that project is now being built. But it took a specific state law. I had to author a bill so we could get that one project going. That's, I think, one example. You know, the other one that is used, and there's endless of these, but the 469 Stevenson project, it's in downtown San Francisco, like surrounded by, you know, an urban downtown environment. I think it's about a block from the BART stop. It's the type of transit-oriented housing we should be building. On a Nordstrom's parking lot, 400 and something units, almost 100 of those affordable, 100% union built, stopped and halted under a CEQA lawsuit. The other thing that I will say, there's all these examples, but what also happens is even just the threat of a lawsuit halts a project. And then when you halt a project, that land is sort of has a scarlet letter because developers don't want to then other developers don't want to buy that if they think, okay, I don't want to put up with the CEQA lawsuit. I'm just going to go find something else. And so it has a real chilling effect on our ability to build literally anything, but, you know, daycare centers, food banks. I mean, there's any number of things. Basically, anyone at any time can do a lawsuit to stop literally anything in California, you know, prior to these bills being passed, which has made it so difficult. But there's tons of these examples. And our hope now is that there'll be far fewer of them.
The housing crisis is so bad that Buffy has to record this podcast from her child's bedroom under a bunk bed.
Yeah, I'm under my daughter's bunk bed. Yeah, exactly.
Well, it's so funny because as we were digging into the research for this episode, you know, we were reading all these blood-boiling examples of things that couldn't get through, whether it was student housing or the food bank or whatever else. But it is what you mentioned is the important thing, which is the chilling effect. We don't know what hasn't been even proposed because of the threat of CEQA lawsuits.
Totally.
Buffy, I do want to throw this question to you. So I want to back out and sort of start with basics. What exactly is CEQA and what did it originally require?
Yeah, you know, when it was passed 55 years ago, I think that was a time in California history where it was orange skies, pollution, terrible air quality, industry had run amok. You know, our beautiful state of California really needed more robust, you know, environmental protections. And the original intent was to say, are we taking into account the environment when we're building public projects? Shortly thereafter, public was determined to be anything, essentially, that goes through a public process, which opened up the floodgates for lots of litigation, which then resulted in where we are today. You know, which is a, you know, sort of the, you know, CEQA is sort of the, I don't know, hand of oppression in many ways of like building what we need to build for the year 2025 and beyond, building the renewable energy projects that we need to, you know, building obviously housing. I mean, we have CEQA when it comes to like climate resiliency, thinning out our, you know, doing fire mitigation, and we have sea level rise, you know, CEQA for any public transportation projects, you know, all kinds of things that CEQA is applied to, many of which are good for the environment. You know, we should be doing everything we can to build more renewable energy, not allowing CEQA to be weaponized to stop renewable energy projects. So that its original intent, I think, was one that was noble, one that I actually agree with. That's why I don't think we should wholesale just get rid of CEQA, but it does obviously need reforms. And I also view, you know, politicians like to say housing is a human right. You know, then let's treat it like that. Let's make it actually really easy. If we believe that that is a human right, let's treat that as a human right, which means we should do everything we can to make it easy to build housing, not allow it to get weaponized by CEQA.
Well, Scott, one way that Buffy talked about CEQA expanding is it expanded to beyond public projects. But another way it's expanded is just it's gotten like much bigger, right? Like the original guidance for it was a 10-page checklist. Today it's 480 pages, which is 48 times. Typical CEQA report used to be 10 pages long. Now it's typically at 2,500. How did it grow like this?
It really became a Frankenstein's monster with layer upon layer of different requirements over a 50-year period, typically created by the courts, not by the legislature. The courts have just methodically, because it's very tunnel visioned. So there will be a case, and then it'll say, well, what about this factor or this kind of potential historic impact or that kind of impact? And then the court says, yeah, you have to consider that too. And it just grows and grows. It never shrinks. It just grows and grows and grows and grows in terms of the kinds of bizarre impacts that you have to consider when you do an environmental impact report. The other piece is we have what's called the administrative record, which is when you do an environmental impact report, the local government has to put together the administrative record, which then becomes the record during the lawsuit. That's a factual record. And because of court rulings, it's like a gotcha. Like you left out the email of the scheduler for the junior planner twice removed from the main planner on the project. And and all of a sudden, boom, your EIR is overturned in court because you left out this really tangential email. And so what that means is that cities will just err on the side of including everything. And so it has a huge administrative record. There's also a requirement of responding to public comments. And in theory, responding to public comments sounds like a good thing, right? Like if someone provides public feedback, you have to respond. But we know that the process gets so manipulated that you can just flood, as Steve Bannon would say, flood the zone with public comments, and then you put the city in a position of having to respond to everything, and that explodes the entire process, explodes the report, explodes the record, and just creates huge public costs. And that's one of the big things here. It's become so expensive to do anything. And this is one, not the only reason. This is one of the reasons. And it's a prime example of a law that was adopted for good reasons and over time just takes on a life of its own and just keeps growing and growing and growing. And as I called it, CEQA is the law that swallowed California, and it truly has.
I do want to quickly mention, so EIR, anytime we use that, that means environmental impact report. And so that was
right. As opposed to under federal law, it's environmental impact statements, I believe.
Oh, gosh.
So,
okay.
Yeah.
But I do also want to throw out, so Reagan was the one who originally signed CEQA into law, but we can't fully blame Reagan, then Governor Reagan of California. It really was the court system and other things where this just became this amorphous blob that expanded.
Well, and Justine, to your point, every governor since Reagan has tried to reform it. So it's been an ongoing challenge.
Well, let's talk about then the stuff you guys were able to get through. Maybe starting with Buffy and then Scott, if you guys can talk about the specific pieces of legislation that made it in the trailer bill that were passed and how they changed CEQA.
Well, in the bill that I spearheaded, I'll let Buffy can talk about her amazing work. We were able to get a few things through. First, we did a significant reform to the administrative record that I mentioned before to make it much more constrained. So that's super nerdy, super wonky, not sexy, no newspaper headlines on that. But it's pretty significant in terms of streamlining the process to reduce the scale of the administrative record. We also made a change for housing for projects that come close to qualifying for a CEQA exemption, but miss the exemption by just a little bit. Right now, or before this law, if you came 95% of the way there and almost qualified for a CEQA exemption, but just missed it, you'd have to do a full environmental impact report as if the exemption didn't exist. We made it so that if you come close to qualifying for an exemption for housing but miss it, the environmental impact report is limited to the small area that you missed. So that's a significant change. We also, when cities every 8 years have to do a housing plan called a housing element to plan for future growth, it's a really important document that then they then have to, it gets approved, and they then have to rezone to implement that housing element, so zone for more density per their plan. When they do that housing plan, it goes through CEQA and it gets approved. And then when they go through the rezoning to implement that housing plan, they have to do CEQA again, which is ridiculous. So we exempted that rezoning from CEQA entirely. And then finally, we adopted a series of new exemptions from CEQA. We exempted childcare centers, we exempted health centers, we exempted food banks, we exempted various climate mitigation projects, we exempted broadband deployment, we exempted advanced manufacturing. So a series of exemptions in addition to all of that. So it was a little bit of a hodgepodge, but it'll have a lot of impact. Buffy's is much more easy to explain and very powerful.
We think all CEQA reform is sexy.
Yes, exactly. We're on the right podcast to talk about how sexy CEQA reform is here. My bill is pretty simple. It basically says if it's infill housing under 85 feet, it's exempt from CEQA, essentially. So housing on our current footprint, 20 acres or less, which is your average kind of mall redevelopment site, for the sort of low and mid-rise housing. It just no more CEQA, just done. We're not doing CEQA for those projects. We're trying to take away one of the main hurdles, one of the main impediments. We're trying to create certainty around the market. CEQA creates so much uncertainty for the housing market. And it was a very clean CEQA exemption for housing. As Scott said earlier, we've been going at this for a number of years, dealing with the politics of this for a long time. There are a lot of people who wanted to keep the status quo as is, that the status quo was working for them. But unfortunately, it was not working for our constituents and people in California who are paying some of the highest housing prices in the country. So really, the politics around this were rather daunting. To land on a clean CEQA exemption, but we did with the help certainly of the governor, which was huge. I mean, he really, this year and on this specific measure, he's always been a champion on housing. Always, we've always been very aligned with him. But this year, he really put all of his weight in on this one, on these two bills, and really decided he wanted these on his desk at all costs, essentially. And that was really helpful for us to land where we did with a very clean CEQA exemption for infill housing.
So I think this is where I want to sort of talk about the national implications for abundance broadly, because CEQA is sort of it's like what's known as a procedural law, like NEPA, in that what it says is you have to study all these impacts. It goes a little further than NEPA, because the NEPA, the national version, so only says study. CEQA says you also have to mitigate. But something I noticed actually specifically in the hearing about Senator Wiener's, when people were talking about the advanced manufacturing exemption, a lot of people, so what Senator Wiener brought up is like we have a bevy of like specific laws around like how much you can emit, toxic waste, pollution, like regulations that are what's known as substantive environmental law, where it's instead of saying, well, you need to study all these impacts, it says, you are not allowed to do X, Y, and Z. You have to keep emissions levels below, a certain number, etc. I'm curious how you are thinking. I'd love to hear what Buffy has to say as well about sort of California environmental law and national environmental law, and that balance between like when it makes sense to have procedural law versus when it makes sense to try to do more substantive law. Because personally, I think a lot of abundance is sort of leaning towards more substantive environmental law as opposed to like procedural.
Yeah, so uh, so the thing with CEQA, it is not substantive environmental protection. As you noted, we have clean air law and endangered species law, clean water law, et cetera, et cetera, and that's important. CEQA it's unbounded, doesn't set standard. It is just process, and it is very subjective, and that's why fundamentally what CEQA is about, not always, but a big chunk of CEQA is about leverage, control, fear, and extraction. And it is about leverage. So you have, people who want to just be able to basically use the law to get what they want, having nothing to do with the environment, and so it gives them leverage to make a project smaller, or to make it different, or to require, say, labor standards instead of just having a law that sets labor standards, using CEQA as leverage to have labor standards. It's about control, people wanting to control what's in their neighborhood and control what everyone else does. It's about fear at times. For example, in some low income communities that have been deeply screwed over time by saying, we're just going to put the most polluting chemical plants and oil wells in, right, or we're going to in your neighborhood, or we're going to build a freeway right through your neighborhood. These communities have been royally screwed over by their own government, and so they view CEQA as a way to be able to fight back. And I understand why they view it that way, because they don't have that many tools. And then extraction, you will have, for example, a clean energy project might have to pay mitigation to do habitat restoration somewhere else. And habitat restoration is great, but we're effectively we're putting a tax on a good thing, clean energy, to fund another good thing, and query whether we should be doing that. So I'm not really criticizing, for the most part. Some people, the NIMBYs, I criticize when the oil industry uses CEQA to try to fight phasing out oil extraction. I criticize it. But a lot of the CEQA uses, the goals, I do not criticize. Certain kinds of environmental mitigation or labor standards. It's the way it's used. It's so chaotic, and it makes things unpredictable and more expensive.
The key thing here, it seems, is that there's ways to do environmental regulation without making it impossible to get housing and daycares and bike lanes in cities and other things like that. Buffy, I do want to ask you, I guess, talking about groups that were very upset about the changes to CEQA. So even with the abundance movement pushing this bill along, change has been difficult. So the Sacramento Trades Council actually told lawmakers that the bill would, quote, compel our workers to be shackled and start singing chain gang songs. I don't know if you actually saw that quote, but I saw that recently.
Oh, I did. Yes.
Okay. I'm curious. Any
I was presiding over that hearing, and I.
Oh, okay. So you were there. You were in the room. I'm curious as to your thoughts on and how do you respond to that sort of rhetoric?
I mean, it's rhetoric, exactly, just that. And the truth of the matter is, many people, including the building trades, have used CEQA for leverage. And I get it, this CEQA for them is labor law. They're treating environmental law as labor law. That was the tool in their toolbox in order to leverage for better project labor agreements, higher labor standards, et cetera. Labor standards that I agree with. I support, I come out of the labor movement. I've worked closely with labor. The quote that you're specifically referring to is referring to the provisions I put in the bill to create a wage floor for your lowest paid construction workers, many of whom are making cash under the table, if they're lucky, $12, $15 an hour. And this would have actually raised their wages and brought in more professional apparatus for their work environment. But the building trades didn't want to entertain that, unfortunately, which I think is a question for them as to why they wouldn't want to have a wage floor for your lowest wage construction workers. This is an industry that is rife with exploitation. And these are predominantly immigrant communities who are very vulnerable now to ICE and the Trump administration, who get f***ed over all the time, frankly, just to be direct about it, at a lot of these workplaces. And so what we were trying to do was raise the floor for them and to bring about more enforcement of current labor law. And I believe our labor law should exist within labor code, not our environmental regulations. Let's have an honest conversation about the labor challenges that are happening, the exploitation that is happening at these workplaces. But let's not use CEQA to do that. Let's actually have a labor conversation and run labor law around that. So, there was a lot of hyperbole, a lot of which was pretty offensive. But it is what it is. It's politics. It is what it is. We landed on, again, a very clean CEQA exemption bill. I feel really, really good about where we landed on this. And I do think it's going to jumpstart production of housing. And I also think we still need to clean up this industry from a labor perspective, which, the carpenters have been tremendous leaders on this. They were the ones that helped me craft the language on this that the building trades objected to. The carpenters build more housing than any other labor union in California. And so I trust their assessment and their judgment on what the labor language should be on these types of bills. And they have just been really forward thinking, forward leaning. They understand that we have to, as Gavin Newsom likes to say, get the flywheel going on the mass housing production that we need to do, because it's also their workers that are suffering most because they can't afford the cost of living in California. So the labor conversation is, it's a third rail in California politics, one that I've been sitting on now for the last 3 or 4 years, riding the third rail there. But one that I think is important just to have an honest conversation with the public and with them and with, our folks that advocate for more housing around, we have to make these different trade-offs, and how are we doing that and what does that look like? And from my perspective, the carpenters have really been on the forefront of being way more pragmatic around trying to actually figure out how to be part of the solution and not the problem.
One question that I've been struggling with a little bit is that, we started the conversation a little bit with talking about YIMBYism and abundance and all these other things. And obviously there's a lot of other factors that have kind of put into getting this passed. But one thing I think about is that for a long time, like, YIMBY was this weird, uncool thing, but it was also kind of bipartisan or cross-partisan, right? You could be a socialist or a MAGA Republican or anything in between. And like, you could get behind like, yeah, we need to build more housing as a message. And now it seems like there's also this conversation that's catalyzed more recently around abundance. And is this an idea for the Democratic Party? And maybe that's something that has helped, Gavin Newsom or, other people, get a little bit more behind the message. I was wondering, are you worried at all about like abundance, like polarizing it, such that it's harder for Republicans or other people to get on board? Or is it, this is just an extra energy and it just adds to the conversation? And it actually helps add energy so that you can get these really difficult reforms passed.
Yeah, I don't know. I think these issues, and we've seen this play out on housing. When we talk about like housing, whether you call it YIMBYism or abundance, just making it easier, it really cuts across party lines. And if you look at, like, I'm authoring this bill now, Senate Bill 79, to upzone and allow for more housing density around high quality public transportation, direct override of local zoning. It's a tough bill. And we've been getting, like, there are Republicans who strongly support it and strongly oppose it, Democrats who strongly support it, strongly oppose it. And we see that all the time with these kinds of bills. So I think when it comes to abundance, I see more critiques on sort of the hard left than I do in conservative circles. I think there are folks on the some folks on the left who are saying, "Oh, is this deregulatory?" And the answer is no, it's not deregulatory. It's about having the right kind of regulation and being smart about regulation. So it's not about eliminating all regulations. And sometimes some people will, in bad faith, paint it that way. But that, to me, is coming from the other side. So I think there's an opportunity to really create broad alliances on this issue.
Yeah, and I sort of, I think the most progressive thing that we can do as someone who represents Berkeley and some of the most progressive parts of the country is make sure our government is working for people. And CEQA was the opposite. It was antithetical to that notion, right? It was not working for people at least certainly when it comes to the infill housing that I was working on, right? So I view it as certainly a progressive value. And at the same time, our minority leader in the assembly was a joint author on my CEQA bill, Republican colleague. And we had pretty strong bipartisan support for this, which is why I love working in the housing space, because I think it's one of the few remaining issues in America today where Democrats and Republicans can come together to actually try to solve a problem. And that gives me a little bit of hope that we're not totally just doomed here in our current political environment, right? And that maybe democracy can withstand. So I think it's helpful. Now, granted, our California Republicans maybe are different than other types of Republicans, and we actually have certainly relatively good working relationship. I know Scott does too with a lot of the Republicans in the legislature. Where we can align, we will. And when we disagree, we certainly disagree. But on housing, it has become a place where there's some alignment. It's my hope that can be a national trend as well.
Yeah, and I've had big, housing bills, abundance housing bills, where we have literally had the most left-wing members of the legislature and the most right-wing members of the legislature both supporting the bill, and some very left-wing and very right-wing members opposing the bill. And so it really does cut across.
I want to do a quick round robin before we go, and then I will let you guys off to the rest of your day. I'm curious, what do you want to see tackled? What sort of gridlock do you want to see tackled on a national level or across other states in the country? And then also, can you give any recommendations for blogs, books, people, Twitter accounts, whatever else that you would recommend our listeners check out? Scott, I'll throw it to you first.
It's still enormous work to do around housing, but I think clean energy, it's horrifying how hard it is to deploy large scale clean energy in this country. That's not just a California issue. It's like, although, Texas and Florida both produce more clean energy than California, even though we're a bigger state that actually believes that climate change is real. And I'm very, very concerned that the psychopaths running our country right now who are now kneecapping the American clean energy industry, which is going to have such toxic ramifications for long-term American prosperity and global strength, as well as, undermining the, AI advancement, for example. And so we need to turn that around. And then for a book, I will say Why Nothing Works was amazing. I know I love Abundance. I love Ezra and Derek. Amazing. I'm so glad they wrote that book, and it's really good. But it overshadowed Mark Dunkelman's Why Nothing Works, which is an extraordinary book.
I'll put a plug in for that too. I really enjoyed that read. And Buffy, what about you?
Sure. The thing that I'm really going to be focused on next, at least in the California perspective, is I'm super intrigued by prefab modular and newer housing innovation, housing construction innovation. And I think we've really just scratched the surface on that. And so I'm going to be taking a deeper dive in that space moving forward, and seeing also what are the kind of other creative kind of financing mechanisms to support more housing production. And then I'll give a super niche thing. I think like our sort of moral compass on housing in California is Christopher Elmendorf, who's a professor who he will just tell it like it is in his perspective on if it's good policy or not, kind of ignoring the politics, which I think is important for politicians like myself to listen, because we want to say that every bill we just pass is the best thing since sliced bread. And he really kind of lays it out, I think, in pretty truthful terms around the efficacy of a lot of the work that we do. And so I just deeply appreciate that, his work and his analysis of a lot of the housing stuff that we do here in California.
He is a great Twitter follow. So
yes,
thank you. Thank you for plugging him. All right. Well, Scott Wiener, Buffy Wicks, I want to thank you guys so much for your time. And hopefully we'll see you soon. Thanks for listening to our very first episode. We'd love to hear your feedback and who you think we should have on the podcast next. And we will be back in 2 weeks' time. See you next time, Pie Gang.